When we see someone in distress, we can help to downregulate their emotional response by being a calming influence and supporting them in that moment. In Resilience First Aid, we talk about that quite a bit in terms of the language and the strategies that we can use to be that presence, and also the concept of co-regulation, like how can we connect with each other and regulate emotions together. Though, what does it look like in the brain when we're actually doing this? Well, luckily for us, some new research were published in Neuroimage, which shows exactly what is going on in the brain and what are the areas that are activating when these strategies are employed. So let's have a look here. And of course, to be able to do this, we first need to get a brain and stress it out. That will give us the chance to then be able to see what these strategies do when we downregulate them or when we support someone else in that moment. So let's say we take a brain like this over here in a nice and calm state, and then what the researchers did was to take some pictures from the International Affective Picture System and then show it to the brain, and bam, we've got a brain here that is now in a distressed state. Now, it might not be a picture of the stock market necessarily, but these days it probably could be. But now that we have that brain in a distressed state, the researchers got them to apply a reappraisal strategy. So reappraisal is a really useful strategy that we talk about quite a bit in composure and that domain of resilience. And that's when you think about the situation in a bit of a different way and you reappraise the emotion, you reappraise what you're seeing, what you're experiencing. Right, so with that in mind, they had a look at a couple of different scenarios. So for the one part, they had the individual do things themselves, and that means they can apply the reappraisal strategy on themselves in that moment when they are seeing that distressing image. Or on the other side, they can also let the person simply permit the emotion to run its course and just experience what they're experiencing. Then they got other people involved, and that's when they have someone else that now provides the reappraisal for that person that's experiencing the image. That's basically one person helping another to deal with the emotion in that state. Then, of course, they also had someone who is essentially just an observer and is just observing the emotional distress of someone else. So what we then get to observe in terms of the results are the effects of applying reappraisal on themselves and permitting the emotion on themselves. And then we're interested in the participants here. So we're looking at this person. What do they experience when they provide reappraisal to someone else? Or what do they experience when they're simply observing and they're not actually helping to downregulate that emotional response of someone else? That's when we get to the results over here. Now, here we can look at a scale of distress. So ideally, we want a lower level of distress. That'll mean that, we're doing well. So what we see here is when an individual is applying the reappraisal strategy on themselves, then they experience a generally lower level of distress. If someone permits the emotion to run its course, so they're not applying any reappraisal, then we see they have a bit of a higher level of distress. And when we now look at this person over here, if they are participating in reappraising and they're helping someone apply that reappraisal skill, then we can see that they also themselves experience a lower level of distress. Though interestingly, when that person is only observing and they're not actually participating in reducing that stress, then we see that they experience a fairly high level of distress. And interestingly, of course, we can see here that it is even higher than the distress that the individual who is actually witnessing the image is experiencing. So that's quite fascinating, and we'll come back a bit more to that later. But in the meantime, we actually want to see what does this look like in the brain itself. So to be able to do that, we need to do some fMRIs. So we take those different brain states and we throw them into the MRI machine over here. And that's when we can see a bit more about what's actually going on. Let's start by first taking a look at the areas that activate when both self and other regulation is being performed. Now, this is generally a collection of areas that, as the researchers point out, is part of the general emotion regulation network. And I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail into these different areas because we want to focus a bit more on some of the other areas that they are specifically pointing out in the research. So first of all, if we take a look on the outside of the brain, so here we can see areas such as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. We can see the middle temporal gyrus activating along with the inferior temporal gyrus, which is further deeper into the brain, connected to the fusiform gyrus. And then when we take a bit of a slice here of the brain around there, then we can see this picture on the right hand side, where now we can see there is in the middle the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex that is activating. There's a supplementary motor area that is activating. There's the precentral gyrus over here activating, the superior parietal lobule, and also the lateral occipital complex, which is, of course, the areas in the back of the brain that is taking the visual imagery from the eyes and doing the initial processing and sending it onwards into other areas of the brain. So quite a lot of different areas involved here. And of course, as usual, we can see the prefrontal cortex playing a role, more in that smarter brain cognition, and a bunch of other areas that are involved with emotional processing and also thinking about self, thinking about others. Now, let's shift a little bit here and just focus on one specific area, and this is an area that is that the researchers saw a lot more activity in when regulating others is involved. So if you're helping someone else, then this area sees a bit more activity. So when you're applying the reappraisal on yourself, this area also activates, but it activates even more strongly when you're doing that reappraisal with someone else. And this area is called the precuneus. So this is sitting right above the cuneus, which is over there, which is where the occipital lobe is. And this is also, of course, looking at the middle of the brain. So we're slicing the brain right down the middle, and we can see it's this whole area over there. Now, the precuneus here is involved in quite a few different functions. So it's involved in social cognition, it's involved in visuospatial processing, reflecting on the self, and of course reappraisal, emotion regulation. So these are more newer activities that is becoming more and more understood now as a function of the precuneus itself. And it's also involved in aspects of consciousness and also the default mode network. So the default mode network is more involved in terms of creativity. It's that area of the brain that tends to fire up, when you're sitting on the toilet and you're just kind of daydreaming and you're coming up with creative ideas because the default mode network is taking over, because you're kind of letting your attention go and just letting the brain do its own thing. So the precuneus here shows us something that is a specific area of the brain that is firing quite strongly. And then we can now look at another part of the brain, which is that they're identifying, which is the temporal parietal junction. Now, this area of the brain is sitting in between two other areas. So we've got the parietal lobe here at the top, and then we've got the temporal lobe here towards the bottom in yellow. And then we've got, of course, the occipital lobe sitting at the back here, the cerebellum below that, and the frontal lobe here at the front, as you would expect. So the temporal parietal junction, or the TPJ, sits here in the middle, which basically is the connection between the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. So what does this area do? Well, this involves a couple of different other areas, such as the angular gyrus, which you can see over here, and it's basically because it sits on a bit of an angle, so that angular gyrus feeds information into Wernicke's area, which is involved in understanding language, and especially when you read or when you speak to someone, understanding that that language is all about what Wernicke does, and that is also involved, this general area, in terms of understanding the mental states of others as well. So we can see quite a few different types of functions that these areas perform. They're very multifaceted in terms of their functioning. So this area also helps to differentiate between self and others. So that, of course, makes sense because we're talking here about regulating others. So this is where we can see this comes in a bit more specifically. Now, if we switch to looking at when specifically when you're applying the reappraisal on yourself, and that's where the researchers saw that the middle temporal gyrus actually activates quite a bit more strongly in this case. So that's the green part over here, and sitting in the temporal lobe. This is involved in visual processing, recognizing images and faces, processing that type of information. Also involved in auditory processing, sound recognition. Also part of the default mode network as well. And when there is dysfunction in this area, then there we see there's a link to major depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia as well. So it's definitely an area that has quite a big influence in terms of this type of wellness and functioning. So what does this mean for us? Well, let's take a look at a couple of key points that comes out of this research. So for one thing, witnessing distress in others can cause high personal distress. So that difference in terms of the distress that the individual who is witnessing and observing is feeling is really, really interesting, because there are many occupations, of course, that you can imagine where this is a common thing. So anything from teachers, what they witness in students and people who might be struggling with things, through to the helping occupation. So anyone that's a carer, doctors, nurses, emergency services as well, firefighters, paramedics, crisis call centers, all those different occupations have a lot of this that they witness on a daily basis. And it's not always possible to help to regulate the emotion of everyone around. So that is where there is a lot of importance in terms of being able to prepare for these type of events, being able to shift your own cognitions about what happens and what you're seeing, what you're experiencing, to be able to build your resilience for this in the long term and avoid compassion fatigue, carer fatigue that is very common in those occupations. Then, of course, we've got that interesting finding that regulating the emotion of others is very similar to regulating your own emotions. So, and that is really useful to know, just that idea of if you do see someone struggling and it is causing you distress, just being more willing to help and also building the skills to be able to help effectively. That's really important. That's, of course, exactly what we're doing in Resilience First Aid, which is, what do we actually say in those situations? What are the skills that we can apply? It's not always just something that we just know, but we can always try, but we can learn these things. We can build our skills and get better at being able to support people when they need us. Then another interesting thing that they found was that people with higher empathy also tended to experience higher distress and also tended to have a lower ability to self-regulate. So this comes from them also applying some questionnaires and doing other tests as well to check the level of empathy that people tended to have and how they then responded to these tests through the research. Now, this is important because having a high level of empathy isn't a bad thing, but it is something that we need to realize about ourselves. So if that's something that you feel is something that you do have a lot of empathy, then it's something we need to be proactive about in terms of learning strategies to manage our own emotions, to be able to apply reappraisal more effectively, and what other skills and strategies can we build to be able to manage that empathy effectively in the long term, because that's really a big part that resilience is about, is sustainability. How can we be in a state that we enjoy, but we can also do that and maintain that in the long term. So, and of course, as you build those strategies, that's when we get into the fourth point here, which is that the researchers found that the precuneus and the temporal parietal junction, those, when they activate more strongly, then there also tended to be lower distress. And that is when we're applying reappraisal and we've got these strategies and we can use them. And as we use them, that's when we see those areas in the brain activate. And what's important, of course, is that the more we practice these, the more we build these skills, the stronger these areas in the brain become, and the better we become at being able to regulate emotions in general, like within ourselves, but also in terms of supporting other people. We know what to say, we know how to reappraise that situation they might be feeling, we know how to help. That is really what's important. And that's really where this is practical research, because it shows us that there are things that we can do and there are areas in the brain that we can strengthen. And when we do that, we become better at supporting others. So it's a fascinating piece of research, and it's really awesome what they've done there to highlight these different areas of the brain for us. It's an open access article, so I highly recommend to download that. Check it out. There's a lot more that they go into detail in there. And if you're interested in learning more about resilience, learning more about the brain, how you can apply these strategies, how you can become better at helping and supporting others, then I highly recommend to check out Resilience First Aid, which is a training course that we provide exactly around all of these ideas. Such an important skill these days to be able to better learn how to support and build resilience in others. So if you want to see more of these videos in the future, feel free to subscribe. And in the meantime, that's all for now. See you next time.